Okay, so if you turn the quilt over, what you would see then is the other side of the story, or you would see the same quilt from a very different perspective. I apologize for the quality of the photo here, but what you're going to see on the victim side of this quilt is a very different story, even though technically it's two sides of the same coin or two sides of the same quilt. You'll notice right away it's a very different kind of perspective. Again, keep in mind the key themes that we're trying to deal with here. Imagine community, how community is created and destroyed and recreated. Uh, Class concepts like the tipping point. The tipping point, of course, applies here when you think about the Middle Passage and the movement of millions of people against their will, how that's going to destroy families and force culture to be recreated in the New World, right? This African American culture is born out of this horrible experience, of course, and folks resisting and overcoming in certain ways. So keep that in mind, too, in terms of both imagined community and tipping point. This is a piece of art, yes, but it's also very political. Right? It's also very political. Themes of gender and race, discrimination and violence, all of these things, all these stories can be told through this quilt, and this is exactly what the artist has done here. The story of the piece is really this. Minda was the artist, I believe it was her great grandmother, and she created this quilt to kind of tell this story of the Middle Passage to her progeny, right, to her kids and grandkids that would come after her, so that one never forgets the sort of trauma of the Middle Passage. And I think more than any article or textbook chapter, this quilt can tell the story better than all of those combined. We're very visual as people, and so I think looking at this can tell us a lot. So think about the politics of this culture in this instance. So what basically happens again is this quilt was passed down, and the quilt's story is this. Minda was a slave on the Middle Passage, right? This forced transportation of people from Africa to the New World. Eventually, for our purposes, ending up in the United States. Not everyone, of course, ended up here, but for our point of the story, this is where Minda ends up. And the story is basically this. On board the ships, it really began this process of the seasoning process, right? This making people into slaves. There's a very famous phrase that says, slaves are not born, they're made, right? Slaves are not born, they're made. And what that essentially means is no one is born believing they should be the slave to someone else, right? No one is born thinking that they're inferior. They're not born thinking that they should work for someone for free or that they deserve punishment, right? All of those things have to be forced onto them, right? So this idea of seasoning, right, making something into something else, creating a product, is kind of how they looked at the process of slavery, sort of making people into slaves for the purpose of labor, right? For the purpose of labor. So Minda's quilt plays a particular role in this story of the Middle Passage. What essentially would happen is that women were often kept on top of the decks, which on one level you might think might be better than being in the hold of the ship. Right? The hold of the ship tended to be extremely hot, extremely dirty. You're chained to the person next to you. If you've ever seen films like Roots or other representations of the Middle Passage, you've had some experience with this, or Amistad or other films that have done a good job of trying to portray this. So you might think that being on deck, perhaps with slightly more space, might be better. But in this case, since men and women were kept separate, and women kept on the decks, there's a whole nother set of circumstances, of course, that might impact the women. In addition to the sun beating down on you all day long, you're under direct supervision and under direct control of the ship's crew and the ship's captain. So imagine being a woman by yourself, ripped apart from family, held by a bunch of men who don't look at you as human, that feel like they can do whatever they want with you. You can imagine the challenges and the violence that might ensue, especially things like sexual violence, right, that women would be particularly vulnerable to. And in these ships, quite often, the ship's crew would be allowed to take liberties with these women, right? Quite often they believed that it was their right to take liberties with these women, which essentially means rape, right? There are many stories about enslaved women arriving in the New World pregnant. And how could that happen? Essentially because the ship's crew would rape them. Yet, part of the ridiculous nature of racism shows up in this story as well, because these men, although many times they wanted to take advantage of these women, they also believed that these people were not people. They believed that they were dirty, they were animals, they were backward, they were unclean, and so they did not necessarily want to touch them. So imagine these two competing impulses. These men want to rape them but not touch them. So how do they accomplish that goal? Minda's quilt. Again, if you look back at the quilt, what you'll notice is that there's a hole in it. There's a hole in the quilt. And according to the story, what happened was this hole in the quilt was used. You would lay the quilt on the woman, and then the ship's crew could take advantage of this woman, rape her, without being in contact with her from their perspective. They could rape her without being in contact with her. So, again, think about the contradictory nature of all of this. But also think about the quilt itself. How does it look different? Right, on one side, it's pristine and clean and doesn't say much. On the other side, the victim side, of course, it's a bloody, violent mess. Right, so this is why I believe that this quilt tells the story of the Middle Passage in some ways better than any book could. We're very visual people, and so in thinking about this particular piece of art as it's been passed down and recreated by the artist, right? This life-size quilt that was displayed in museums for years, right? It's going to tell the story to thousands, perhaps millions of people in a way that a textbook might never be able to do. So this is really the story of Minda's quilt. On one hand, it's a story of violence. Right? It's a story of rape and sexual oppression, racial oppression. Right? It's a story of dehumanization and all of these things. But you also want to think about how this is a story of survival. It's a story of resistance. It's a story of folks on the Middle Passage surviving long enough to have children, so that the story could later be told. So we never want to end just with the story of the violence and the destruction, although that's an important part of the story. I always want to emphasize survival and resistance, the fact that people would resist slavery on every level, including resisting capture, resisting on the Middle Passage and such, as we'll discuss in other moments. At the same time, we want to discuss racial oppression as important, and also gender, how certain aspects of gender might make one's experience different, even on the Middle Passage, for men and women. Right, think about this case in terms of Minda's quilt as well. So often looking through the eyes of black women at this history can tell us even more. And in some instances, looking through the eyes of black men. In some other instances in particular, we'll try to discuss that. So I want you to think about the how and the why of gender as well as race. Keep in mind the law of matrilineal descent as well. That's going to be a law that will essentially legalize rape. That's essentially going to legalize and make profitable the sexual oppression of black women and allow slavery to grow here in these United States. So keep all this in mind as you look at Minda's quilt, and we'll talk more about these things and unpack them and try to connect them to some other ideas. Thanks.